Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Lean Startup Conference India pre-conference webinars. Today we have Ben here. Ben is the author of Lean Analytics book, a must-read for any internet marketer. And I would ask Ben to introduce himself and get started with the Lean Analytics model. To you,
Great.
Ben.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Ben Yoskovitz. I'm the co-author of Lean Analytics. I wrote it with a good friend of mine, Alistair Kroll. And today, what we wanted to go through, I guess, is some basics of Lean Analytics. Now, Ramahan, I have a slide presentation, so I think I'll just switch to that. Does that work?
Definitely, Ben.
Okay. So let me switch to that now. Ooh, I gotta find. Hold on. I'll just do entire screen, and then Okay, let me pull this up. Play. Okay. So I don't. Can Ramahan, can you see that?
Yes, yes, Ben, I can see that.
Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, so at least I know that you can see it because I don't think you can see me anymore talking, but
Yeah.
hopefully you can see the presentation. Just before I begin, versions of this presentation and other presentations are definitely available on SlideShare. So if I'm going through things a little bit quickly or there's things that you wanted to follow up on, by all means, you can just go to SlideShare and look at this version. There's shorter versions. There's even longer versions of these presentations that myself and Alistair have done on Lean Analytics. There's also a free course on Udemy. So if you go to udemy.com and you look up Lean Analytics, you'll see a workshop we did there for a couple of hours a couple of years ago. So I wanted to give people a high-level overview. I wanted to try to get through this fairly quickly and then leave chance for questions if we can. Maybe you're able to write them in and we can respond that way. And you can see my Twitter handle there. So after the presentation later on, if people ever have questions, I'm an easy person to find. So one of the questions we often get is, well, why did we write this book in the first place? And we wrote the book back in 2012, if I remember, 2012. So it's been a couple of years now, but so you have to sort of go back a little bit in time. But why did we write this book? And it actually comes down to Lean Startup, of course. So book is a combination of Lean Startup and data and analytics. And I think everybody is going to be familiar with Eric Ries's book and Lean Startup, but think back at the time, 2010, 2011, it was just starting. This was just becoming a thing that was being discussed and codified and explained. And this is one of the core principles, right? The basic of Lean Startup, which is build, measure, learn. And in theory, that sounds incredibly simple, right? And it's sort of an elegant way of saying, we have to constantly iterate. You have to go through this cycle over and over until you get to product market fit. And I know for myself and others, this was sort of a revelation of, wow, up to this point, we've been doing things wrong or not as well as we could. And finally, somebody was helping guide us through this process. But what we learned as we went through it and as we walked other entrepreneurs through the process is that there are problems with it. So let me start with ideas, right? So everybody has good ideas. Everybody believes they have great ideas. That's usually not where people get stuck. And the build part is pretty straightforward as well, right? People tend to love that part. And I don't know the makeup of the audience today, but oftentimes you're talking to founders or developers or even marketers, but people who like getting their hands dirty and building things. And that's not really the problem with this concept either. Where things start to fall apart is measure. And of course, if we don't measure things properly, then there's no data and there's no learning. And what we found is, we would help entrepreneurs through the concepts of minimum viable products and lean startup, and then it would get to the measure part, and it would be, well, what do we measure? How do we measure it? When do we measure it? And all of those become critical questions to make this process of lean startup successful. So first, what is analytics? Analytics is the measurement of movement towards your business goals. So this is actually quite important because, and the words that are highlighted, of course, are the ones that matter, right? So first of all, you have to know what your goals are. And if you don't know what your goals are or what problem you're trying to solve, then how do you know if you're working towards achieving that goal or solving that problem. And it's about movement. It's not about a point in time, although oftentimes we do look at data and say, what does the data look like today? But it's actually about progress, or if things are going bad, lack of progress. And for startups, the purpose of analytics is to iterate to product market fit before the money runs out. And so this is about helping you get through lean startup and get through these processes that Eric Ries and others have explained in a very practical way. So let me talk about 4 things that make up or define a good metric. So the first thing is that a good metric has to be understandable. And so you want to be able to, this is the kind of metric that sits on a big dashboard on a TV screen in your office. When you talk to somebody and you say, here's the number 1 thing I'm focused on right now, that should be simple for them to understand. And for them to understand what problems are you working on, how are you going to solve them, and how are you measuring things. And we can often get caught up in too much data and sort of paralyzed by trying to analyze a whole ton of information. Number 2, a good metric has to be comparative. So I have a very simple example here: active users versus active users per month. So if you say to me, Ben, I have 1,000 active users, I have no idea if that's good or bad, or terrible or fantastic. If you tell me I have 1,000 active users this month and last month I had 500, that's a little bit more context. And so typically when we look at metrics, we look at them over time. We want to compare them over periods of time. But even that's not fantastic, right? Because last month I might have had 10,000 signups, or let me say last month I might have had 600 signups and 500 active users. That's fantastic. This month I have 1,000 active users, so I've doubled my active users, but maybe I had 10,000 signups. That would suddenly tell me there's actually a problem with my numbers. And that's why a good metric is typically a ratio or a rate. And so here we have percent monthly active users. So in that example I gave you, last month the percent of monthly active users would be very high. This month that percent would be very low. That would actually tell me there's a problem, not something that's going well. And finally, and most importantly, a good metric has to change your behavior. And so, this is the big lesson for me: is if a metric won't change how you behave, it's a bad metric. Now, what does that mean? That means doesn't mean you don't track a lot of stuff, because you never know when you're going to find interesting data. And I'm going to show you some examples of that later. What it means is when you look at a number and you say, I don't know, no matter how this number changes, I don't know what I would do about it, then that's not a number that you want to focus on today. You want to focus on numbers that are going to help you change your behaviors. All right, so let me give you some examples of what I call types of metrics. So first we have qualitative metrics and quantitative metrics. And this, if you're familiar with Lean Startup, should be very familiar to you. So qualitative metrics or qualitative analytics is unstructured, anecdotal, hard to aggregate, hard to measure, but it's really the why things are going on. And when you're early in your startup process, most of the data you're collecting is qualitative, right? You're doing interviews with people, you're collecting feedback from people. You don't have a lot of hard numbers. Then as your startup matures, you get into quantitative data. And this is sort of, your numbers and your stats, your hard facts, but truth be told, you get less insight here. So quantitative data tells you what's happening. It doesn't tell you why things are happening. And so the lesson here for me is this: that you want to discover things qualitatively, what's going on. You never want to stop talking to users or customers, right? Even as your startup matures and you start to collect more data, you don't want to just stop talking to people. You always want to be discovering things qualitatively and then proving things quantitatively. And I see a lot of startups, they start with that qualitative stuff. They talk to some people, they do some interviews, that's wonderful. As soon as they're able to start collecting data, all they're looking at is hard numbers. But remember, those numbers don't tell you why things are happening. They just tell you what is going on. All right, so another interesting way of looking at metrics is exploratory metrics and reporting metrics. So exploratory metrics are speculative. So they try to find those unexpected or interesting insights. And reporting metrics are, predictable. These are the things that keep you, abreast of what's going on day to day. And so you of course need some key reporting metrics day to day. Daily active users, churn rate, these kinds of things that matter depending on your type of business. But as you start to collect more data, you're going to want to be able to essentially, in layman's terms, ask questions of the data. And that's when really interesting things start to materialize. And it's difficult to do that early on, but later on it becomes much more powerful. So let me give you an example of that. So this is a company that was originally called Circle of Friends. And Circle of Friends started, I mean, we're talking, 2007. So, back in the day now, we think like 8 years ago. And Facebook, if you remember back then, was still quite early. And they were able to leverage the way Facebook allowed you to invite friends before they kind of locked that down. They grew very, very quickly. This was actually like Google Plus or Google Circles, but inside of Facebook. And they grew to 10 million users very, very quickly. So you would look at that and say, oh my God, this is a home run hit. It's gone insanely viral. They have 10 million users. This is fantastic. This is on the way to being $1 billion business. Here's the problem with Circle of Friends. They had terrible engagement. So when Mike Greenfield, who was the founder of this company, was looking at it, what he realized was, sure, he was able to exploit Facebook to grow very quickly and get tons of users, but very few of his users were using the product. And so even if he had every user on Facebook or had 100 million users, if none of them were engaging, then he didn't have a business. It was not a solid foundation. So what did he do? He went and looked at his data. So, he had the benefit of lots of users, therefore he had lots of data, and he went and he dug around. And what did he find? He found that moms are crazy. Now, I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that in a good way, because what he found was he found a segment of his users, in this case moms, that by every imaginable metric, and there's some examples here that they're not really important, but by every imaginable number he could think of, moms were incredibly engaged with his product. So what did he do? He actually pivoted. This is a great example of a pivot. He went from Circle of Friends to Circle of Moms. Now, what that means is that 95% of his members he abandoned because most of them weren't moms. And so you would look at that from the outside and you might say, this guy's insane. Why is he only focusing on one segment? Why is he ignoring his 9.5 million other people? Well, it's because they were useless to him. He couldn't build a business with them. And he was able to grow this back up and eventually sold this company. And so that's a good example of a couple of things. One is using exploratory data to sort of look at things in your business to figure out what's actually working and what's not working, and also a really good example of a pivot. All right, so another way or type of metric is lagging and leading. So lagging indicators and leading indicators. So a lagging indicator is a historical metric. So it's essentially reporting the news. So a good example of that is churn. If you're familiar with churn, it's essentially typically calculated as the number of customers that abandon your service on a monthly basis, or the percentage of customers that abandon. And of course, once they've churned, they're gone. And it turns out, in most cases, particularly with SaaS businesses, it's quite hard to get those customers to come back. And let's say you look at your churn for last month, then you go and say, well, geez, I need to fix these things. You fix them, and you hope that churn improves for that month. And so it's an incredibly important metric, but it's always lagging where you are today. A leading indicator is a number that shows you a metric for tomorrow. So it's essentially making the news. And an example of that might be customer complaints. So imagine you're running a SaaS business, you're looking at customer complaints, and you can look at this daily. And all of a sudden, customer complaints start to spike. And you know that if customer complaints spike or start to go up, that there's a very good chance those customers are going to abandon. And as a result, churn is going to increase. Now, churn is difficult to react to because it's lagging, but customer complaints is easier to react to. You can immediately go in and figure out what's going on. Is it a buggy release that we just did? Is it maybe somebody in customer support isn't responding fast enough? So you can immediately go in and try to solve problems. And if you lower customer complaints, you can feel reasonably confident that you're going to also lower churn when you calculate it down the road. And so you start typically with lagging indicators because those are the numbers that you have, but you eventually want to get to these leading ones that tell you what's going to happen, that essentially predict the future. All right, so let me talk to you about the Lean Analytics framework. So we looked at a lot of things, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with many things like Dave McClure's Pirate Metrics or Sean Ellis's Growth Pyramid. And so we looked at all of these different things and took elements from those pieces and tried to come up with our own framework that would help people understand what number should I track right now? And because I think that's ultimately the most challenging question that people have. What should I focus on right now? And so we looked at sort of two major things. We looked at the business that you're in, and we looked at the stage that you're at. So we looked at 6 types of businesses, and you can see them there: e-commerce, SaaS, free mobile apps, so forth. And the truth is that businesses are very complex. It's rare that a business fits into one of these perfectly. Oftentimes, businesses are versions of these things. So I'm a mobile commerce app. I'm a two-sided marketplace with a SaaS component. Think of Amazon, right? Amazon is an e-commerce website, but it has a lot of user-generated content. And so oftentimes you have to blend these things together, but we separated them to look at them individually and try to map these businesses out. And then we looked at the stage that your company is at, empathy through scale. And I'm going to talk about both of these. First, I want to talk about business models. So this is not just about how you generate revenue, because not all businesses, certainly from day one, generate revenue, and that's fine. Oftentimes, consumer applications, that's not the core focus, nor should it be. But a business model is basically like a systems diagram, and I'm going to show you what this looks like right after. It's designed to map out essentially all the touch points that a user or a customer will have with your business. So you can almost map out their lifetime experience with you. And when you do that, you start to sort of see where the trouble points are. And you start to see sort of, well, what part of this system diagram am I really on? So let me show you what I mean. This is a very complicated slide, and it's what we call the SaaS customer lifecycle. So this is a SaaS business. Typically, you think of these like freemium SaaS businesses. And what this is doing, or trying to do, is map out the customer's life cycle through the business. And so you can see, if I walk through this quickly, I have customer acquisition at the top in that sort of green color. Then I have a visitor to my website. Then they come to the website, they take the free option or the trial option, they eventually enroll, they become a user, then they become an engaged user and they become a paying customer towards the right, or they become a disengaged user, they cancel. And so you can sort of see the whole map, right? Now, imagine you've just started your SaaS business. You don't care about, in the top sort of right-hand corner where it says upselling. You don't care about that, right? You might not even care about paid conversion when you first start. When you first start, all you might care about is, does anybody show up to my website and does anybody sign up for free? So that's a good example of being able to say, what is imagine the whole life cycle of somebody through my product, through my company, through my experience, and start to identify the metric that's going to matter at each step. And then depending on what stage you're at, which I'll cover in a moment, you're able to say, hey, you know what, all I care about is, does anybody show up at the website and sign up? Because I've just started. Later on, I want to care about, do they convert from free to paid? And I want to optimize that. And so you can see this sort of like a funnel where you're optimizing one step after the other. And so I would really, really encourage everybody to take a step back, take a moment from busy days, from stressful startups, and try to map this out for your business. So we've done it for 6, like I said, we did it for 6 businesses. You can take pieces of those from the book, you can mash them together, but this I think is it's very illuminating when you look at this to say, wait a second, what do we need to focus on and what metric actually is going to tell me if this is going well or not. So for example, even if I use this as an example, customer acquisition cost, although it's at the top of this chart, I don't care about that on day one. Right? All I care about is, do people show up? What it costs me to acquire them, I'm going to optimize that later when I'm attempting to scale the business. And so it's very easy to get distracted by these things if you don't have this sort of visual representation of your business. All right, let's talk about lean analytics stages. So essentially, Alistair and I came up with these stages, and we talked to a lot of startups and a lot of bigger companies too, and believe that most I won't say all, but most companies go through these stages in order to be successful. And you'll see when I talk about the sort of gates that you need to go through in order to justify, if you will, to yourself, I'm ready to move to the next step, that you'll see where there's some failure points, and you'll see examples, for example, you see examples like Circle of Friends, which I talked about, where they went and grew really quickly but didn't have the engagement that they needed. And that was kind of a, what we would describe as a house of cards, or a poorly built foundation, and then it eventually crumbles. But let's walk through these. So empathy is stage one. And empathy is really, if we think about this in lean startup vernacular, this is the problem solution interview stage. You haven't built anything yet. You're trying to validate a problem. So, and ideally, to get through this, you've found a real poorly met need that a reachable market faces. And again, this is the interview stage. Everything you're doing here data-wise is qualitative. Maybe there's some survey data that you're working on, but initially it starts with those interviews. And the truth is, I think now that lean startup is so well recognized as a good process to go through, people do go through this stage. I still, in a lot of my work with entrepreneurs, I still feel like they skip a lot of these steps. That's not maybe the right way of describing it, but they kind of go through empathy really quickly because it's pretty painful. Right? You have to go and validate that you found a real problem that people recognize. This is oftentimes people will say, well, I talked to my friends and they thought it was a good idea, so I'm just going to build something. And I'm sure you've had that kind of experience yourselves. It's hard to go out there and put yourself out there and say, I think this is important, I want to go build something, and have people tell you, no, that's a stupid idea. So people, I think, recognize that this is an important step. I think, truth be told, I think they skip it quite often. But let's say we get through empathy, then we go to stickiness. And stickiness is really about building that first minimum viable product, that MVP. And to get through stickiness, what you're trying to do is that you figure out how to solve the problem in a way that people will adopt, keep using, and possibly pay for, right? Because not all things here have to be paid for at this stage. But what you're looking for is usage. So, if you have a daily use app, you need a high enough percentage of your people who are using it on a daily basis. If you have a weekly use app, you need people using it on a weekly basis. This is basically to prove that those early adopters that you talk to in the empathy stage, and a growing number of early adopters are in fact using this product and gaining value from it. It's not perfect, it's still got bugs. It's still very small and simple as a solution, but it's good enough that people are engaged and continuing to use it. If you don't have engagement or stickiness at this stage, you really want to be careful about moving on, just like that Circle of Friends example. And truth be told, I think this is where most startups actually fail. So they might not realize they failed at this point, and they might continue down through the stages and keep growing their business, but they've actually failed because fundamentally they didn't build something that enough people want to use on a frequent enough basis. So let's say we get through, and I know that sounds sort of depressing, but let's say we get through stickiness, we go to virality. And this is not just about consumer virality when we think about things like the viral coefficient. This is basically saying, I have an early adopter group, they use the product, it's solving their problem. I now need to figure out how to scale acquisition. I now have to look for those scalable channels to acquire more users. Some of that may be virality, and truth be told, ideally even in a B2B business, there's some measure of virality, but ultimately this is about finding repeatable, scalable mechanisms for acquiring users. And so now what metrics are we looking for? We're looking for an equal amount of engagement. It might drop a little bit, but we're still making sure that we don't just pile a bunch of people into the business and they don't use the product at all. That's a fail. We're still looking for a high quality amount of engagement, but now we're looking for growth. So now we're looking for, does acquisition through Facebook work better than Twitter, work better than SEO, so on and so forth. Next, you would go to revenue. And revenue is really about optimizing the economics of the business. So you may have been charging from day one, that's totally fine. You may have been charging during the engagement phase, stickiness, virality. but you haven't necessarily optimized for revenue. Now you really want to optimize for revenue, and this is where, think of this like an equation, right? This is where your lifetime value has to be much higher than your cost of acquisition. This is where you need to optimize that cost of acquisition because you're starting to acquire many more users or customers. And this is where the math has to kind of make sense for this business. If the math doesn't make sense of this business, then it doesn't matter if you have 100 million users. If you lose $1 on each user and you have no way of making it back, you have a failed business. And then finally you get to scale. And scale can mean any number of things depending on the business. It might mean, much more active push on outbound sales. It might mean making APIs available for people to partner with you. It might mean business development opportunities. Scale can mean any number of things. But these 4 stages are really what you want to go through step by step in order to prove to yourself and for your business to make sure that it's built on solid foundation. So let me give you a quick example. I want to make sure we don't run out of time. We started a little bit late, but I want to give you a couple of quick examples of this. And so this is a company called LocalMind. I was an early investor in this company. They were acquired by Airbnb, which was wonderful. But this is back when they started in 2010. And this was a real-time Q&A platform for location. So when you had a question about a specific location, like what are the specials at that restaurant, or what's the weather like here, or how long is the line at this particular place, you would use LocalMind to do that. And one of the things that they were concerned about was, would people be willing to answer questions about a place in real time? So to answer questions for themselves before they did anything. So here was one of their #1 concerns was, would people answer questions? So before writing a line of code, they wanted to try to de-risk this business and figure this out. Because they felt like people would ask questions and they would go unanswered. And then you would have a bad experience and you wouldn't use LocalMind again. So what did they do? They ran an experiment on Twitter. So they were tracking geolocated tweets in Times Square in New York, and they were messaging people who had just tweeted from Times Square, asking them questions about the area. Just random questions about Times Square in New York to see if anybody would respond. And interestingly enough, the response rate to tweeted questions was actually very high. So this was essentially anonymous people asking strangers questions about Times Square because they had just tweeted from Times Square, right? So not the perfect experience, but the response rate was, I think it was something like 50%. So that was a good enough proxy for LocalMind to de-risk the solution and convince the team to continue. So when you think about that, and now the truth be told with LocalMind, and this is true of many businesses, was they quote unquote solved that problem for themselves and felt like, okay, people will answer questions. The real problem was people didn't have enough questions to ask. So it's just because you solve one problem doesn't mean you've solved the next problem. But this was for them kind of that empathy stage right before stickiness. They said, let's go try some things, almost a concierge MVP, if you've heard that term before we actually go build anything, because building mobile apps, if that's what you're doing, is not easy to do. And you can't, particularly for iOS, you can't just hack something together really quickly. There actually has to be some polish to it. So those MVPs can be quite expensive. So they were able to de-risk this and move to the next stage. I'm going to give you another quick example of this. So this company is called Static Pixels, and what they were doing at the time was allowing you to print eco-friendly prints of your photos, and specifically your photos from Instagram. So Instagram was starting to blow up. Again, this is 2011 or so, 2012, 2011, I think. And Instagram is starting to blow up, and Static Pixel says, great, people take all these wonderful photos on Instagram. Wouldn't it be awesome if they could print them eco-friendly prints? And so off they go to start this business, and they had this one idea, and the idea was that they would allow people to instantly order any photo off Instagram and have it printed. So this was what they thought was going to be their hook, was lots of people take awesome photos on Instagram. You're scanning Instagram, you're looking at photos, you say, wow, that's a beautiful photo. I would love that on my living room wall. And they would, what they called Insta order. So that was their big thing. Now, this is what it looked like. This was kind of the flow for a user with Insta order. So you'd click checkout, you'd have to sign into PayPal, confirmation page, confirm your order, go back to PayPal, and then authorize pre-approved payments so that that Insta order feature would work. And so this was, quite a bit of friction for people. And pre-approved payments on PayPal, people do it, but it's not super common. A lot of friction in this experience. And it turns out nobody did it. It turns out people weren't ready to Insta order prints off Instagram. And the real challenge here for static pixels was, what were they optimizing for? Well, it turns out with that Insta order feature, although they thought that was going to be their value prop, they were really trying to optimize for repeat orders. Right? At that point, they're optimizing almost for revenue. They're not optimizing for first-time purchases. So they were already assuming people would order prints off Instagram guaranteed. They just assumed that was 100% true, and then they were going to do this other value add feature. So it's optimizing for the wrong thing. They took out the Insta order feature. Of course, the flow of ordering became much simpler, much less friction, and they were able to double transactions, lower the bounce rate on their website, because their website said download Static Pixels app, order photos anytime from Instagram. The first version of it talked about, you can instantly order, all this stuff. People didn't understand what they were talking about. And so they simplified the product and they optimized for what really mattered was, can I get anybody to buy a print off Instagram in the first place? Let's not worry about repeat orders first. And so the lesson here is skip steps at your own risk. If you want to go to virality first and try to grow massively big really quickly, but nobody's using your product, you're very likely to fail. If you want to try to optimize revenue before anybody's even signed up in the first place, very likely to fail. All right, so how does this all come together? We take the business that you're in, and again, there may be a blended version of this, of course. You take the stage that you're at, and you find what we call the one metric that matters. So this is a big part of the lean analytics idea and a big part of the book. And we basically say that at any given point in time, there's one single number that you can track that tells you how the business is doing. And everybody can look at that number and understand what's going on. Now, of course, the number is going to change, right? As you move from stage to stage, even as you're moving inside a stage, those numbers may change. You may focus on one thing this week, another thing next week. But the goal here is to really force people to focus on what matters, to ignore the noise, and decide what they think is really going to help them move their business forward. So let me give you another example of that. So this is a company called, now they're actually called Moz. This slide is, I guess, slightly outdated, but this is an SEO toolkit company. You may have heard of these guys. And when they raised, so they're already in the scale stage, so they're further along. But when they raised, I believe it was their B round, possibly their C round of venture capital, one of their VCs went in. It was Brad Feld. You may have heard of him before. And he came in and he said, you're tracking too much stuff. I can't tell what the hell's going on with this business. I know it's going well, but I can't tell what's going on. We need to reduce your KPIs. And so they reduced those KPIs to focus on one number, which they call net adds. And net adds is very simply, on a daily basis, the number of new customers minus those customers that have left. And so to Moz, net adds is essentially a business health indicator. Now, this doesn't mean you only track one single number. It just means that, again, when you think about that dashboard, this is the big number that sits in the middle of the dashboard. It's the number that everybody is aligned around. If there's a problem with net adds, everybody throughout the whole company has to know that. Now, of course, when you're in a small startup, that's easy. As a company grows, that becomes a little bit more challenging. But they use net adds as a business health indicator. What does that mean? Well, let's imagine net adds is going up. That's awesome, right? That's wonderful. That means the business is getting healthier. Then they have to go and dig in and say, well, why are net adds going up? Was a marketing campaign successful? Did we lower customer complaints and then lower churn? Did we upgrade the product, which is encouraging more people to stick around? they need to go figure out why that one metric that matters is moving in that direction, look at the metrics underneath that, and then try to continue to optimize that, because of course you just want to keep doing more of the same to continue to drive net adds forward. If net adds is sort of neutral and not moving, then you have to ask yourself slightly harder questions. Can we acquire more valuable customers? Maybe we do have to look at the product and say, what could we put into the product that will increase engagement? Maybe we have to look at our customer support and say, maybe there are some things slipping here which is causing an imbalance between new signups and churn. And then of course, if net adds is dropping, now we have a real problem, right? Now we know that less people are coming into the service than are leaving the service. And now we have to ask ourselves really hard questions, right? Really, what the hell is going on at that point? So again, net adds doesn't tell you everything that's going on. It's a good indicator to get people moving in the right direction and asking the right questions. And that's a good way of thinking about that one metric that matters. It's not the only number that you track. It doesn't mean that when you're running some smaller experiment, you're not looking at a very small number or a more specific number, but you make the assumption and then you have to figure it out if one number is sort of related or correlated to your one metric that matters. Now, choosing your one metric that matters isn't enough. You actually have to draw a line in the sand as well. And so what does that mean? That basically means that you need to set yourself a target. So if you decide your one metric that matters right now is churn, and churn is 8%, you have to decide, you have to figure out for yourself, well, what should churn be? And it turns out this is really hard to do. There's no rules here for these things, and businesses are different, and the stages are different, and so it is hard to find. So you have to do research, you have to talk to other entrepreneurs, you have to look at other similar businesses and try to understand what are their targets or their goals for specific metrics. Let me give you a quick example of that. So you may have heard of a company called TimeHop, and TimeHop, I would say, still in the virality stage, although this slide is again from a couple of years ago. But the idea, TimeHop is basically a social network around your past. So you connect your social services like your Facebook, your Twitters, your Instagrams, and every year it shows you what you were doing a year ago. And it's pretty cool. I use the app, and I have kids, so I took pictures 3-4 years ago, and then I see those things come up. Oh yeah, on this day 3 years ago, on this day 4 years ago, on this day 2 years ago. Now they have really, really good engagement. People who use TimeHop love TimeHop, and they're addicted to it, and they use it very frequently. The problem is getting virality, right? So they got through stickiness, and then they had to get through scale. Through virality. They just had to acquire more people faster. So their focus was virality, but not, even though it's a consumer app, not on that viral coefficient where one person invites another and that person signs up. In fact, they were focused on content sharing. And so what they were looking at was the percent of daily active users that share content. Because you have to share your, I see a memory from last year on TimeHop, and I say, wow, that's an awesome memory. I reshare that essentially on Facebook. It gets stamped, came from TimeHop, and other people see that, and they're like, what the hell is this TimeHop thing? That's really awesome, and they want to participate. And they had a target of 20 to 30% of daily active users need to share content in order for these guys to grow the user base to the degree they wanted. And I think this quote from Jonathan is great when you think about these early consumer apps that get some kind of stickiness but then really have to go and acquire millions of users. And he says, all that matters now is virality. Everything else, press, publicity stunts, something else, is like pushing a rock up a mountain. It will never scale, but being viral will. And that's what TimeHop continues to focus on. And that's what talking about drawing a line in the sand becomes so important. So here are some benchmarks, right? These are lines in the sand that Alistair and I found while we were doing research for the book. And what's important to realize about these is, A, they change over time, of course. B, they're different for different types of businesses, right? So, for example, time on site, 17 minutes. What type of business is that for? That's a media company. That's a social network. That's Reddit, actually, right? That's not a productivity app where you're supposed to use it for 5 minutes a day and then get out of the app. If it turns out that people are on your site for 17 minutes and the goal is that their session's only supposed to be 30 seconds long, that tells you something's wrong, right? So these are just examples of benchmarks. I think one of the interesting ones for mobile applications is engaged visitors. And this came actually from Fred Wilson, who is a very famous and successful venture capitalist in New York. He said that you want 10% of your user base to be active on a daily basis, and you want 30% of your user base to be active on a monthly basis. If you have that on a mobile application, you've got something that's sticky. Is it perfect? No, but you've got something that when he's looked at a bunch of mobile companies in his portfolio, that's when he starts to see, my hand is going up. You can't see my hand, but that's when you start to see that inflection point of, okay, now we need to focus on that growth and virality, right? So these are examples of benchmarks. You need to go figure out what your own might look like. All right, the last thing I want to cover is the lean analytics cycle. So the lean analytics cycle takes all of these ideas, puts them together. This is essentially build, measure, learn, but with more detail focused on data. So let me show you what that looks like. And so again, we've got to find a business problem that matters, right? What are we really focused on? Pick the one metric that matters, draw the line in the sand, and start experimenting. So let me show that to you. So we pick that one metric, we draw the line. I'm going to use churn as my example. So churn is 8% for my SaaS company. I want to get churn down to 5% because I've done some research and I know, talking to people, that if I can get churn to 5%, and this is an early stage SaaS company, that's good enough for me to move to the next stage, which is to start acquiring more users. 5% is not great. At scale, 5% is too high, so eventually I have to go back to churn and probably try to get it closer to that 2% benchmark, but for now I'm just trying to get it to 5%. So then I look for a potential improvement. What can I improve in my startup or my business to drop churn? Now, if I don't have a lot of data, it's early, ultimately you want to make a good guess. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean is don't get caught in analysis paralysis, right? Figure something out to do and try it. Don't rebuild the whole app, don't change anything massively, but just look for something and try it. Don't wait for the data. As much as the book is about data and as much as I care about data, I care about speed too, and I care about action. Now, if you have data, you look for what we call a commonality. So that, for example, might, if I use, again, Circle of Friends as an example, he had lots of users, then he went and looked for some data, and what he found was that, a certain demographic used the product like crazy. This happens a lot in SaaS businesses, right? They start out, they're targeting, their target is very broad, industry-wise, and then for whatever reason, lawyers are using the product like crazy, or a certain segment of business, or a certain type of user. The director of marketing seems to be really using this product like crazy, although I really thought it would be the director of HR. So you look for those commonalities, and you say, wait a second, maybe there's some changes we have to make to target more people like our best users. On my blog, a while ago, I wrote a post which basically says, go look for your best users. Every startup has users. Every startup has a small percentage that use the product like crazy. What makes them special, or what makes them common amongst themselves, so you can go find more people like them. Then you're going to come up with a hypothesis, right? And this is lean startup, pseudoscientific method. If I do this, this will happen with this result. And I would really encourage you, like I encourage you to draw that system diagram for your business, I would encourage you to write this down. I would encourage you to write it down on a whiteboard. So everybody who comes into the office or is in your business is focused on this thing. What are we trying to do? Now, then you have two choices, right? So I've got a hypothesis. I want to drop churn from 8% to 5%. I figured out some things I want to try. I have a hypothesis. I can make changes in production, or I can design a test. And early on, I think most of the time we're just like, you know what, just make these changes in production, see what happens. Of course, you can get more sophisticated, A/B test. You can deploy changes only to certain customers and do those kinds of things. If the infrastructure doesn't exist to do it right away, I would encourage you to move faster with a larger group of people versus trying to build that infrastructure right away. Then, of course, you measure the results and you ask yourself, did we move the needle? So we said churn was 8%. We wanted to get down to 5%. Where did it get to? Let's imagine we got to 5%. Success, and that's fantastic, right? Now, truth is, it's going to be very rare that you go through this cycle once, but let's say we did that. Now that we've got churn down to a level that we're comfortable with, what do we do next? Well, we pick the next metric that matters. And now that the bucket is less leaky, the next metric is probably going to be something around user acquisition. It might be fantastic. Now that we've got more people sticking around, I want to optimize conversion on the website because lots of people are showing up, not enough are converting to sign up. And if I can get them to convert and they stick around and they churn at the same sort of frequency at that 5%, that's a good thing. So usually when you fix or solve one problem, it's going to logically tell you what the next problem is. Let's imagine it was 8%, it stayed 8%, nothing I did mattered. Here you can pivot or give up. Now, give up I think is pretty drastic at this stage, of course. Pivot is a real option, right? And you may have learned things through this exercise that tell you, you know what, I was originally focusing on this segment of the market, I should focus on this segment of the market because I moved churn only from 8% to 7%, but for this particular segment, it's actually 4%. So you're always learning through this process. This may help you figure out where you can point the business next. And if you do pivot, then of course you're going back through the cycle again. One option is you can draw a new line. So in this concept, what you're doing is you're saying, well, I got churn from 8% to 6%. It's not quite 5%. But for now, it's good enough, and I'm going to move on and revisit it later. That's definitely an option. You want to be very careful about that one because you could ultimately be lying to yourself about it, but it's definitely an option. Most likely what's going to happen is you're going to move churn from 8% to 6% or 7%. It's not going to be where you want it to be, and you're going to try again. Just like build, measure, learn, you iterate and iterate and iterate through this cycle multiple times till you get to where you want to be, and then you go to the next problem, the next issue, the next metric, and work on that one. And that's it. So thank you very much, everybody. That's my contact information, by the way. My email address, my blog, the website for the book. So you're welcome to reach out to me at any time. Happy to answer questions when I can.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks a lot. Even though I have read the book and also done the course on Udemy, it was very helpful.
Great.
Ben, what are all the tools do you use for measuring analytics? What are your favorites?
Yeah, I mean, you know what? Generally speaking, I'm actually fairly tool agnostic. I can tell you what we're using at VarageSale, where I work today. So we use Google Analytics for some things. We use Mixpanel for a lot of our sort of funnel tracking and engagement inside of the application. For event tracking, did people go through these 5 steps that we wanted them to go through, as an example? And for us, because we're a bit of a later stage startup, we have a lot of homegrown analytics tools, which I don't necessarily recommend from the beginning. I think you can use a combination of Google Analytics, a Mixpanel, a Kissmetrics. Like there's enough tools out there. I use usertesting.com as well for just that like quick testing of things that we put out. So those are some examples of tools. But I think I worry less about the tools, particularly at an early stage, and worry more about getting into the best practices of tracking these things and thinking about these things. So, for example, when you're building a new feature, you're always thinking to yourself, how will we know if this feature will be successful or not? What could we measure that would tell us that that's true?
Yeah. Ben, regarding the one metric that matters that we're talking about, so sometimes, so recently in Intuit, when we were doing a startup app, there were 2 conflicting metrics that came into consideration. So one was NPS versus the session time. So I was wondering, so both of them were indicating the health of the business at that point in time, and so if I were to apply the one metric that matters to this app, is there a principle by which I would decide one amongst the other, saying that this is how I would go with the session time against the NPS or vice versa? Would you recommend any principles about that?
I would need to know a little bit more about you cut off a little bit, so I don't know if you told me what the app is. Can you give me like a brief 10 seconds on what the app is?
So the app is primarily managing tax for the users.
Okay.
So TurboTax, if you're familiar with that. So variation of that is what we were trying to build. And
Right.
then right. So as we were building it, there were two things, and this was at the scale stage of the product where we have garnered enough users. At that point in time, we had two conflicting metrics to measure. One was the NPS versus the session time of the user, because the ultimate goal was to reduce the time spent on preparing his taxes, his
Right.
or her taxes.
Right.
So let's say we have two conflicting metrics. So me as a product manager would go about deciding which one do I need to go with?
Yeah, so it's an unbelievable example because oftentimes I say please, and I think I've written this, like, please don't build tax software because you only use it once a year. The lag time to measuring the value creation is so big that
Right.
you can't use engagement, really any engagement type number, which most I would encourage most startups to use engagement as some engagement level number for the one metric that matters. I think in your case, so like even measuring, like, did they use the software 1 year and then did they use it the next year? It's so long of a lag time. It's really hard to use that as a number. I would probably use session time. Worries me, and the reason I say that is because sure, you want to reduce session time, but there's so many variables in people's ability to use something like tax software, and I'm not sure you're going to get good data on what their session time was with the previous software that they used. So session time to me feels like one of those things that you would want to optimize for, but I don't think if you lowered session time, it would tell me that they would necessarily use your tax software again. And so I think, and I'm going to say this sort of like, unfortunately, I think NPS is probably a better measurement because after they use the software, which nobody likes doing their taxes in the first place, if the NPS is pretty high, then that's a good indication that even though they're doing something they don't really enjoy doing, you've made it more enjoyable for them. And that to me would be a good indicator that they'll probably use the software next year.
Got it. Thank you. So the way I understand this is there's a lot of judgment involved at that particular point in time, where we need to weigh in which metrics actually make sense for us at that particular point in time, and
That's
then
right.
move on with it.
That's
Right.
right. Yeah, it definitely does. And I think you have to you think about these things in order, right? So the way I started thinking about it was, okay, imagine I've lowered session time. Well, how do I even know what session time was before? Okay, I don't know. Maybe you have some rough idea. Great. Other software session time is an hour, and for ours is 30 minutes. That sounds like a value prop. Maybe they do get, but maybe the person's like inept on their computer and their session time is 60 minutes, but they're still super happy because it was better than the previous experience. So that feels kind of like I can logically argue myself out of how that one really helps me understand the business. I think the
Yeah.
ultimate metric for you guys, I think the ultimate metric when you're more in the scale stage is going to actually be around revenue, right? Truth be told, if you look at the overarching health of the business, NPS isn't going to tell you if people pay you money. NPS will tell you people are happy, which tells you they'll probably pay. So the metric probably is more along the lines somewhere in the revenue, lifetime value, area where it's like, well, we know people stick around for 3 years with our software, so the lifetime value is X. And so if we can get more customers, we can increase revenue. That means the business is healthy. NPS is an indicator of that health. And so it may be the indicator you use when you're building, the next iteration of the product, and then you release that version to customers, and then you look at NPS and say, oh, NPS went up. That's a good indicator that they'll renew next year, which means lifetime value will go up, and that's actually the number we care about.
Thanks, Ben. So that brings me to one more question that I have. So when I looked at the stages that you had outlined, saying that it's empathy, stickiness, followed by virality, and then revenue. During my startup days, when I tried to map the experience that I had with the experience that has been mentioned, um, I'm curious to know that, do you think revenue is strongly tied with that of your stickiness as well? Because I had to change my pricing model at least 6 times
Right.
before the stickiness actually crept in, post which the
Yeah.
virality actually kicked in. So
Yeah.
just wanted to get
No.
your opinion on that.
Yeah. No, I get it. It depends on the business, right? So in a B2B business, I think of early revenue as a very good proxy of value creation, right? Which basically means if people are willing to pay you early on for your product, that is a very good indicator that they're getting value from your product. Not always, but people paying money is a very good indicator that they need the product and they're benefiting from it. Now, it could very well, like at the stickiness stage, I still think what you're looking for is usage of the product at the end of the day, right? Because they may pay you and never use it, which means they're probably not going to renew. Depends on the type of business, of course, but that would be a shocker, right? So it's like, well, they all paid, and then next year they don't renew, and you're like, uh-oh, what happened? But it is a good benchmark for saying in a B2B, early B2B business, we're creating value because people are plunking down money. When you get to revenue stage, I think that's much more about economies of scale, right? And having a mathematical formula that works. So you might be playing with that pricing formula early on to get the right kind of user in that then becomes sticky. Later on, you have to look at things like, well, what did it even cost me to acquire that user in the first place, right? So imagine a scenario where you realize that your price has to be, $1 a year, insanely cheap. Well, yeah, of course people pay, but then when you go and you say, well, it cost me $10 to acquire that user, so it's impossible. Like I can never make money. You can wait a little bit. Revenue is really about optimizing that equation, right? And if you optimize too much for that equation early on, it doesn't give you the freedom to experiment with acquisition that may be too expensive, but that can be later reduced in cost because of economies of scale.
Sounds good. I know we're on top of time. Ram, Brent, Ben, is there a possibility for one more question, or should we take it offline?
Yeah, probably one last question.
Okay, cool. So, Ben, one last question that I have is, how about what's your opinion about segmentation and cohorting at this point in time? Like, for instance, when you talk about the one metric that matters, let's say churn is the metric that we're looking at. How do we go about creating cohorts around it or segmenting it even further to understand it better? Your thoughts
Sure.
on that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I skipped the some of the slides around cohort analysis just because it's a little bit more complex.
Okay.
But absolutely, I think you do want to get into a mindset of doing cohort analysis right away. And just for people listening, cohort analysis is really just like measuring different groups of people, typically over time, right? So here's my first batch of users. Here's my next batch of users. And so my first batch gets, a certain experience, I make some changes, and then I bring a second batch of users in and see what happens. And yeah, I mean, the sooner you can get to that level of, I'll call it sophistication, I think the better. It is more sophisticated, it's harder to understand, it's harder to measure, but it will help you because, your existing users are already affected by their existing experience, right? So, like you can't test price changes easily on existing customers. You have to go get another batch or another cohort and test against that.
Thank you, Brent. That was really helpful.
Great.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks a lot for your time. People may be having many more questions. Probably, if you have any good questions, probably I'll mail you.
Yeah, if anybody has by all means, you can find me on Twitter. You can shoot me an email. I may not respond super quickly, and I am going on vacation next week. But I do try to answer folks if they have questions. Twitter and email are the best ways to reach me.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'll pass on your contact details again via the blog
Okay.
where I post this video.
Perfect.
Great, thanks again.
All right, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Really appreciate your time. Have a good one.